Good evening, everyone. So I'm Dr. Sainath. I'm a consultant medical oncologist at Care Cancer Institute, Hyderabad. So today I'll be talking about briefly about bone marrow transplant and its role in hematological malignancies. So basically, transplant, just like any of the organ transplant, this also involves use of stem cells, uh, which we replace. Uh, but there are wide applications of bone marrow transplant, including hematological. In a lot of hematological, most common is the use in hematological disorders, but we also do use in non-hematological disorders, especially certain enzyme deficiencies, certain neurological disorders like adrenal leukodystrophy. In the recent ones, something like multiple sclerosis, where it has shown some efficacy. So today, I will be focusing mostly on the role of bone marrow transplant in hematological malignancies. So next week, I'll be talking about its role in non-hematological conditions or non-malignant conditions in hematology.
Excuse me, sir. Hello.
It's not recording.
Yes, it's recording now. It's recording now. Yes.
Right. Yeah. So hi. So a brief introduction. I am Dr. Sainath. I'm a medical oncologist and pediatric oncologist, and also specialize in bone marrow transplant. I work in Hyderabad in Care hospitals. So today I'll be discussing about the basics of bone marrow transplant, its role in hematological malignancies. Like we all know that the bone marrow transplant can be, the applications are wide. It's not only in hematological disorders, there are also certain non-hematological disorders, congenital disorders, where it has a big role. Even in certain neurological disorders like adrenal leukodystrophies, multiple sclerosis. So this week, I would only focus on its role in hematological malignancies, the types of transplants, how we go about everything in transplant. Next week, we will discuss about its role in non-malignant conditions, hematological and non-hematological. So the more appropriate term for a bone marrow transplant is hematopoietic stem cell transplant, because that is what we basically do. We are just replacing the existing stem cell. Now, based on the source of the stem cell, we can divide it into an autologous, where we use the stem cells of the same patient for reinfusion into the same patient after a conditioning regimen. And in allogenic stem cell transplant, we use the stem cells from a different source from another individual after appropriate matching. So why hematological stem cell transplant? So when we want to treat a malignant condition with the use of high dose chemotherapy. So when we do give high dose chemotherapy, there could be a permanent damage to the stem cells. So in such cases, what we do is we store these stem cells and reinfuse them after the high dose chemotherapy for an adequate marrow recovery. So that's the whole concept behind autologous stem cell transplant. So we synonymously use the word stem cell rescue. So high dose chemotherapy followed by stem cell rescue is nothing but an autologous stem cell transplant. So when these new stem cells develop, whereas in allogenic, the source of the stem cells is from other patient. So what does this do? That when we use the stem cells of other patient, they develop the capability to control the underlying disease in the recipient. So it could be two major. One, it could be the graft versus disease. If we are using it in leukemia patients, we call it as a graft versus leukemia effect, where we expect the donor stem cells to act against the malignant cells of the recipient. Or suppose the recipient doesn't have, like in primary immunodeficiency disorders, the patient doesn't have an adequate T cell function. So that T cell function is replaced by the new stem cells by producing the unaffected T cells, especially in genetic disorders. So when do we do? Like I said, we do it. The most of the indications are in blood disorders, but also there are other rare systemic diseases where we do. Among the among the malignancies, there are hematological malignancies as well as certain solid malignancies where we use hematopoietic stem cell transplant. So what are the conditions? So if we broadly divide the malignancies in which we can use, among the hematological malignancies, the acute leukemias, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, acute myeloid leukemia. Among the chronic leukemias, chronic myeloid leukemia and chronic lymphocytic leukemia, even though the indications in the situations in which we need a transplant in this chronic leukemias are decreasing, but yet they do find we do find certain indications in certain subset of patients where an allogenic stem cell transplant improves the outcomes. Lymphomas, where Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's lymphomas, high-grade lymphomas, either in certain lymphomas in the upfront setting or in relapse refractory setting, where we use an autologous stem cell transplant. Myeloma, by far the most common indication for autologous stem cell transplant is myeloma. So, autologous stem cell transplant is known to improve survivals and to have a prolonged disease-free remissions in myeloma. The other newer entity which has where the diagnosis of this condition has increased over the years, hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis, HLH. It could be primary or secondary in nature, and here also transplant has a very big role to play. Among the solid tumors, especially in pediatric patients, neuroblastoma, Ewing sarcoma, germ cell tumors are the common conditions where we often use hematopoietic stem cell transplants. So now if we come in depth to the hematological malignancies where we use, in acute leukemia, the most common indication is acute myeloid leukemia, which we most often see in the elderly, in the adults than in pediatric population. And based on the cytogenetic risk category, the indications are transplant. So when we say CR1, it's a complete remission. The moment the patient achieves a complete remission, either in an intermediate risk category or in high risk category, the upfront allogenic stem cell transplant is recommended. Or if the patient has a relapsed acute myeloid leukemia, there again it's indicated. Or any patient who doesn't go into remission after upfront chemotherapy is an indication for stem cell transplant. By most of these acute leukemias, the preferred type of transplant is allogenic stem cell transplant, except in acute promyelocytic leukemia, which actually has very good outcomes with upfront chemotherapy or differentiating agents. So most common indication is in the relapse cases, where again an autologous stem cell transplant is preferred, especially when the patient is in molecular remission. Someone who is not in molecular remission in acute promyelocytic leukemia, or someone who has relapsed after autologous stem cell transplant, we do consider allogenic stem cell transplant. Again, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, it's the blood cancer which you most commonly seen in kids, whereas in adolescents and in adult patients, it's the incidence is lower. However, these adult patients with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, they fare very badly even when you use pediatric regimens. So in these patients, again, when they attain a complete remission in the first CR itself, high risk, especially when they are BCR-ABL positive or they do have any of the high risk cytogenetics, you definitely suggest a allogenic stem cell transplant, especially when a donor is available. For any relapse case of acute lymphoblastic leukemia and any patient not in remission, similar to AML patients, you do recommend a allogenic stem cell transplant. Among the chronic leukemias, especially in CML, after the advent of imatinib in the breakthrough year of 1999-2000, the number of transplant CML patients undergoing transplant have decreased drastically. So if we divide the CML before 2000 and after 2000, before 2000, allogenic stem cell transplant was the only means to attain a complete cure in CML patients, irrespective of their stage, be it a chronic phase, accelerated phase, or blast phase. But after we got imatinib and other tyrosine kinase inhibitors, the indications of transplant have also changed. So in a patient who is upfront tyrosine kinase inhibitors, when they don't achieve the required milestones in the disease, which we call TKI refractory cases, you can consider an allogenic stem cell transplant. For patients who have not responded to at least 2 lines of tyrosine kinase inhibitors, there again there is a good clinical evidence for transplant. And still, for an accelerated phase and a blast phase patients, you start them on either chemotherapy or a TKI based regimen, bring the patient into a chronic phase, and then proceed for an allogenic stem cell transplant. So in CML patients, either in accelerated phase or blast phase, hematopoietic stem cell transplant is still the standard of care. Whereas in chronic lymphocytic leukemia, most of these patients are above the age of 70. So there are very small indications, especially patients with high risk first or greater remission, especially the 17p or TP53 mutated patients. They are refractory to chemotherapy. They are somewhat sensitive to ibrutinib. Those patients are, again, there is good clinical evidence you can go. Or when these patients transform to high grade lymphoma, there again there is a role of allogenic stem cell transplant. Especially we recommend these for younger patients who are otherwise fit and they have a high risk of disease progression, symptomatic disease progression. The other very rare kind of leukemias, T cell and B cell pro-lymphocytic leukemias, again there is a rare indication for allogenic stem cell transplant. These are rare diseases. As far as my experience goes, I haven't seen, probably I've seen only one case of pro-lymphocytic leukemia, but these are quite a rare leukemia. Here also, again, allogenic stem cell transplant definitely helps. Now, lymphomas constitute a large chunk of autologous stem cell transplant. So here again, even in lymphomas, there are certain specific situations where an allogenic stem cell transplant is preferred over auto. Especially when someone relapses Hodgkin's lymphoma, be it a diffuse large B cell lymphoma or a mantle cell lymphoma, and for the sake even follicular lymphoma, when they relapse after an autologous stem cell transplant, the desired mode is allogenic stem cell transplant. Otherwise, in Hodgkin's lymphoma and diffuse large B cell lymphoma, most of the cases you use in either primary refractory or in a relapsed case of lymphomas, you go for an autologous stem cell transplant. More often, you actually give a salvage chemotherapy regimen, bring them into a complete remission or a partial remission, and then proceed for an autologous stem cell transplant. Whereas in T cell lymphoma, even though these are again the incidence of these lymphomas is less, there is no hard data, but most of these high grade lymphomas, especially when they present in advanced stage, you do recommend autologous stem cell transplant in CR1. Relapse refractory, you give it in all patients. Mantle cell lymphoma, again, which is a high grade B cell lymphoma, you consider autologous stem cell transplant in CR1. Especially the younger patients, the patients who have an aggressive variant of mantle cell lymphoma, especially the blastoid variant, autologous stem cell transplant is preferred in the first line setting. And Burkitt's and plasmablastic lymphoma, again, Burkitt's lymphoma are a highly chemosensitive disease. So very few patients actually relapse or become refractory where an autologous stem cell transplant is recommended. Plasmablastic lymphoma, again, you see a lot in HIV positive patients. These are quite aggressive lymphomas. Most of them, very few patients actually attain a complete response after the first line chemotherapy. So again, an autologous stem cell transplant in a complete CR1 is standard of care for plasmablastic lymphoma, even though they are a rare aggressive variants of lymphoma. Now, like I said before, in autologous stems, if you look at the indications for autologous stem cell transplant, the largest chunk of patients undergoing autologous stem cell transplant are patients with plasma cell disorders. Especially, the most common plasma cell disorder is a multiple myeloma. So it is still, despite a lot of newer drugs being available, it is still the preferred choice of consolidation after initial therapy. It produces durable disease-free survivals for most of the patients, and we have seen patients who survived for 6 years, 8 years, 9 years, even 10 years after transplant without relapse. Plasma cell leukemia, again, is an aggressive variant of a multiple myeloma where the peripheral blood contains more than 2000 or 20%, more than 20% of plasma cells. It's an aggressive variant with a poor prognosis, and most of these patients require autologous stem cell transplant, and if they relapse, an allogenic stem cell transplant is also recommended. Poem syndrome and amyloidosis are again a spectrum of these plasma cell dyscrasias where they have very good outcomes in with autologous stem cell transplants. A point about primary amyloidosis is here, even in Poem syndrome, is the disease, the burden is less, but because of the paraproteinemias, there are multi organs which are affected. So when you, even though the disease burden is low, so when you use a good induction regimen and followed by an autologous stem cell transplant consolidation, the clone is eliminated and the disease is in control for quite longer period of time as compared to multiple myeloma. The key is you try to identify a patient with primary amyloidosis early and treat them, take them for transplant before the end organ damage occurs, especially the cardiac part. So patients who don't have cardiac dysfunction are the ideal candidates for transplant in primary amyloidosis. So even the role of allogenic stem cell transplant in plasma cell dyscrasias comes when they relapse after autologous stem cell transplant. But most often the patient's conditions, general conditions are not so favorable for an allogenic stem cell transplant. But in younger myeloma patients, we do see certain patients who are eligible and fit for an allogenic stem cell transplant, and which produces durable remissions as well. So another hematological malignancy which are not aggressive but they have a high chance of progressing to an acute leukemia, myelodysplastic syndromes, especially the intermediate and high risk one. If a patient is young, most of the times these diseases we see in elderly patient more than 70 years, 65 years. But if a younger patient who is less than 65, a 55-year-old or 60-year-old who presents with a myelodysplastic syndrome, irrespective of the risk category, allogenic stem cell transplant is their only chance at cure, especially if they have a sibling match. Therapy-related AML and MDS, again, the treatment of choice after you bring the patient to a complete response, complete remission, especially therapy-related AM, the choice of treatment is allogenic stem cell transplant. The other chronic myeloproliferative disorders like myelofibrosis, hypereosinophilic syndrome, you do an allogenic stem cell transplant, even though these conditions are rare, and the evidence regarding allogenic stem cell transplant is still based on case series or retrospective studies. There are no randomized controlled trials, but still the only chance at cure is allogenic stem cell transplant. So again, it depends upon the age at presentation, the general condition of the patient, the comorbidities, where we do consider allogenic stem cell transplant in these patients. Not every patient goes. Among solid tumors, especially in children, most of the pediatric solid tumors, when they are high risk or they relapse, there is a role for autologous stem cell transplant. Germ cell tumor, when they relapse and refractory disease, Ewing sarcoma, neuroblastoma, Wilms tumor, medulloblastoma, certain malignant brain tumors, they have a role of allogenic stem cell transplant. However, soft tissue sarcoma, non-Ewing soft tissue sarcoma, RMS, again, the role of transplant is, there is no good data. Apart from that, the other soft tissue sarcomas and osteosarcoma, rarely we do an autologous stem cell transplant. But yes, there is some data to suggest that autologous stem cell transplant can be done. But it's of late, we are not doing, at least in these two patients, soft tissue sarcoma and osteosarcoma. But the rest of the pediatric tumors, yes, there is definitely role of autologous stem cell transplant in relapse refractory settings. So after now we understood the indications of transplant in malignancies. Now, how do you assess the eligibility of transplant? So when we look at the eligibility of transplant, there are certain things which we need to take into consideration if it is autologous or allogenic. So for an autologous stem cell transplant, whether there is a disease related indication, like in lymphomas and myelomas, where it is recommended. In lymphomas, especially the relapsed refractory ones, there is a indication for autologous stem cell transplant. Now, it's not like every patient who has an indication for autologous stem cell transplant can go for stem cell transplant. The important thing is you need to bring the disease into remission or control the disease. So the autologous stem cell transplant, the principle is you address the microscopic or the residual minimal, the minimal residual disease which is present after bringing the patient into a morphological remission. To address that microscopic disease, you give high doses of chemotherapy. So in a chemosensitive disease where the disease has been controlled by a good salvage chemotherapy regimen, you consider an autologous stem cell transplant. Experience tells us that in a refractory disease, an autologous stem cell transplant may or may not bring long-lasting remissions. So most of the patients who have active disease or who haven't responded to a salvage chemotherapy, your autologous stem cell transplant may not be of much use, and the probability of survival is just up to 10%. So of late, all the newer drugs, salvage drugs which we use in these lymphomas, you try to bring the disease into the minimal possible level, a partial response or a complete response, and then go ahead with autologous stem cell transplant as a consolidation. Now, apart from that, you have to look at the performance state of the patient. Can't do it in an unfit patient, and someone who have all the organ functions, decent organ functions, like someone with a renal function, good renal function, creatinine of less than 2 milligram per deciliter, unless and until it is for a myeloma or a renal amyloidosis, where some amount of renal dysfunction is accepted. And in some patients where, especially when you are using conditioning regimen which affect the heart, you prefer the left ventricular ejection fraction to be more than 50% or at least 40%. A good pulmonary function test, liver function without any frank cirrhosis or chemotherapy drugs induced liver damage, adequate psychosocial and financial support. We have to ensure that autologous stem cell transplant is a planned procedure. So, looking at the psychosocial aspects of the patient is also very important, because you're going to lock up the patient in a transplant ward for the next 3 to 4 weeks. So staying in a room for the next 3 to 4 weeks might not be easy for most patients. So the adequate psychiatric evaluation is also a must. And also, you also do a bone marrow examination before going for an autologous stem cell transplant. One, to look, sometimes the lymphomas, they involve the bone marrow, to look whether there is a bone marrow involvement or not. And also to look for myelodysplasia. Often, the drugs which we use in management of these lymphomas can cause myelodysplasia. You have to see that whether there is a myelodysplasia or not, because if there is a therapy-related myelodysplasia, you would prefer to go for an allogenic stem cell transplant. The same is true for an allogenic stem cell transplant, except that there are risks. You estimate the risk associated with the transplant. So someone with good risk are the candidates who are younger age, don't have any organ dysfunctions, don't have any active infections, and the primary disease is under control, and they have an HLA matched donor. They have a very good decreased chance of transplant related complications. They have a lower risk of post-transplant relapse. But the candidates who are at an older age, comorbidities, and where the primary disease is not under control, and the patient has received multiple lines of therapy, so they are the ones who are high risk candidates. But nonetheless, sometimes you don't have any other option than to go for an allogenic stem cell transplant, to explain the risk and take the patients for transplant. So again, you have to look at all the organ functions. So for an allogenic stem cell transplant, cardiac reserve of more than 35% is sufficient and a pulmonary function of more than 35%. Because it's not that these patients are going even with an slightly abnormal cardiac function, they are likely to tolerate transplant. It is only because most of the conditions in which allogenic stem cell transplant is recommended, there is no other option, choice. So that's why your threshold for the organ reserves is also lowered. Now, autologous stem cell transplant, it's always the stem cell source is the patient himself. The problems which we face in autologous stem cell transplant is about the stem cell yield which we get, because the patient is heavily treated with chemotherapy before, especially in case of lymphomas, and in case of myeloma, sometimes lenalidomide causes a lot of stem cell dysfunction. So you may not get adequate stem cell yield. There you try to use plerixafor and also chemomobilization to get adequate stem cell yield. So apart from that, there are no other problems in autologous stem cell transplant, especially when coming to the stem cell collection. But whereas in allogenic stem cell transplant, it's a completely different scenario and different setting, where you need to select the donor. And how are you going to select the donor? And based on the donor relation with the relationship with the recipient, we can say it's a matched sibling, matched unrelated donor, haploidentical donor, or a cord blood transplant, umbilical cord blood transplant, where the source of stem cells is the cord blood. Now everything has an important role. The preferred mode, the preferred donor is always a matched sibling donor. So when we do matching, it's the match is about the human leukocyte antigen. So class 1 and class 2. So among the class 1, you look at class A, B and C, and in the class 2 you see DRB1 and DQB1. Some would even see DP also, but a DP mismatch again can be a permissive and a non-permissive one, which may affect the disease as well as graft failure. But more importantly, these are the 5 HLA antigens you will be looking at for a match. Now, when you do matching, whether two patients are same, you do a serological typing where the antigen matching is done using serological antibody based assays. This is now obsolete. We have stopped using this. Now we have gone for more molecular typing, where we use molecular typing. We do the allele matching by typing the HLA genes by their DNA sequences and see whether there is a match. Now again, in this molecular typing can differ by resolution. So basically there is a high resolution which probably costs more but is more useful. In a high resolution typing, the sets of alleles that encode the same protein sequence for a specific antigen also they also sequence for the antigen binding site. So if we say the report says suppose HLA A 02101, so it also types the antigen binding site. A low resolution typing is you are only typing the allele but not the specific antigen binding site of the specific protein. So that way, high resolution typing, you know what is the depth of match, and you can lower the risk of complications. So most preferred in most of the centers is high resolution molecular typing. It's only in resource limited setting where low resolution typing has done. But all over the world, even in India, most of us do high resolution molecular typing of these basic 5 genes, of these basic 5 haplotypes, I mean antigen, HLA class. So what do we say when we say a matched sibling donor? So for a matched sibling donor, you look at only 3 haplotypes. In class 1, you look at HLA A and B, and in class 2, you look at HLA DRB. So if there is a 6 out of 6 match, it means every patient for each gene would have 2 alleles, one from the mother and one from the father. So if there is a 6 out of 6 match between 2 people, between the recipient and the donor, you call it as a matched sibling donor. So why do we call it a sibling donor? The chances of a 6 by 6 match is mostly with your sibling, and the chances of match is 25% for each sibling. So among the, suppose we have a good uh, suppose the patient had 4 siblings and 2 of them have the match. How do you select the donor in that case? Who is the most suitable donor? Then you look at the age, you look at the CMV status, and then you look at the gender. So you prefer males, then nulliparous females, then females. So a male donor, the risk of graft versus host disease is less than females, because in females there is a possibility of developing antibodies because of the especially children, especially when they have born children, there is a possibility of antibodies against certain HLA haplotypes. So this could result in graft failure, and preferably if both the donor and recipient have the same blood group. If they don't have a same blood group, we still do go for the transplant, because rather than the blood group, it's the HLA match which actually matters. But if you have the choice between 2 donors, you would definitely look at a younger male who is CMV negative of a same blood type. That would be a very ideal sibling donor. So like I said, someone who has it's very common that we get 50% of a gene from the mother and the father. So the possibility of 2 kids having similar sets of allele is only 25%. Now suppose if you HLA type the other siblings, and if there is 6x6, you call it a HLA match. And if there is only 50%, where at each allele level only one allele is matching, then you call it as a haplotype match. So most often it's the haplo-identical which you get than a sibling. The chance of having a matched sibling is only 25%, which is 25% for each sibling. It's not like if someone has 5 siblings, they will have 50% chance of a match. No, for each, the chances of having a 6x6 match with each sibling is again just 25%. So what do we do when there is no matched sibling donor? So after the initial typing of HLA class 1 and class 2, these 5 haplotypes. So if someone doesn't have a 6x6 match, you look at these extended HLA-C and DQB1 as well, because HLA-C mismatch in an unrelated donor is associated with increased GVHD and graft failures. So you do molecular typing of these 10 HLA alleles, and this is considered standard. So we call when we say haploidentical donors, like I said previously, at least in the 3 of the loci, there is a 50% match, and these are haploidentical donors. And most commonly, source is either a sibling or a parent. So someone's parents are haploidentical donors, so they can be donors as well in certain conditions when there are no siblings. So this is how you go. You first identify the patient who is fit for allogeneic stem cell transplant, and there is an indication, and all the siblings and the patient undergo HLA molecular testing. And if there is a 6x6 match, you go ahead with the transplant. But if there is no match, you look whether there is an 8x8 match, and if it's yes, then you look at the DQ also. And if DP, very few patients see, like you have in HLA class 1, 3 ABC, and HLA class 2, 3 DP, DQ, and DR. So DP is the least important one. If there is sometimes what people say, even if there is a mismatch, it is known to cause some graft versus disease or leukemia effect, and it is going to benefit the patient itself. So someone who has an unmatched matched unrelated donor, what we call MUD, you look for donor specific HLA antibody. And someone who doesn't have this matched unrelated donor, the donor can be among the other siblings or kids or parents or first degree relatives, where there is at least 50% match available, and you proceed with an haploidentical transplant. Especially in acute leukemias, AML patients and ALL patients, where you have brought the disease, into you are likely to risk a disease progression, and it eventually affects your outcome. So if someone doesn't have a match, you proceed with haploidentical transplant, especially in AML and ALL patients. Sometimes in pediatric transplants, especially because kids with leukemias, because kids the body weight is less, you can go for a cord blood transplant. The good part of the cord blood transplant is, even if it's a 4x6 match or a 5x6 match, or if it's a mismatch, the chance of graft versus host disease is very less. But the flip side is the time taken for engraftment. What we call is the time taken for the normal hematopoiesis to begin and to reach the absolute neutrophil count of more than 1,000 and platelets of more than 50,000. The engraftment process is quite longer. You need to manage that longer period of neutropenia, sepsis, and infection, which can be a challenge in a country like ours, where the chances of multi-drug resistant infections is very high, even in a transplant setting. So after this is done, especially when you have a sibling transplant, or if there is a matched unrelated donor transplant, you also look for donor-specific HLA antibodies. So why is it important? The presence of donor-specific HLA antibodies is associated with increased risk of graft failure. You don't want this, especially if you are using a very high dose of chemotherapy in conditioning regimen in allogenic stem cell transplant. You don't want a graft failure, because with that doses of chemotherapy, the chances of recovery is very less, and if you are likely to have a graft failure, you are going to lose the patient. Now the recipient should actually go screening for the donor specific HLA antibodies, especially if there is a HLA mismatch, and also even if there is a match. So a preference is given to a donor with haplotypes to which the recipient has no antibody. So the most important implication of this donor specific HLA antibodies is, when you are treating a patient with acute myeloid leukemia or acute lymphoblastic leukemia, these patients who fall into this high risk or intermediate risk category, and that these patients would require transplant in the future, you avoid blood from close relatives, from parents, siblings, and this one, because you risk the development of donor specific antibodies. So the siblings, parents, all of them are potential donors. So if someone lot of time, we encourage the siblings or the parents or someone to donate the blood and give that blood to the child. And sometimes even the parents insist, why can't you just give our blood? We don't want someone else's blood to be given to the child. This is very important. We need to actively discourage. Even most of the blood banks are sensitized to this fact, so they generally avoid giving a related blood or platelet transfusion to the leukemia patients, because if someone develops this donor specific HLA antibody and they go for an hematopoietic stem cell transplant from these donors, we end up with a graft failure and the likelihood of losing patients. So it's like a very detailed planning right from the time of diagnosis, especially in acute myeloid leukemias for allogenic stem cell transplant. So now, once we have selected the donor and we have checked for all the organ functions which are adequate, we proceed for a transplant. When we proceed for the transplant, the first thing we need to do is to ablate the marrow, to create the space in the bone marrow so that the new stem cells can home and start normal hematopoiesis. So that process, which we call as conditioning, and the conditioning regimen, and there is a lot of science to it. So basically, conditioning regimen types, depending upon the intensity, is divided into myeloablative, non-myeloablative, and reduced intensity conditioning. So a myeloablative conditioning regimen, it basically consists of a single and a combination of agents at high doses. They cause profound pancytopenia in 1 to 3 weeks from the time of administration. most of them are long lasting and irreversible until and unless you give a stem cells. So unless the hematopoiesis is restored by infusion of hematopoietic stem cells. So you need to give hematopoietic stem cells after the conditioning regimen. Spontaneous. These marrows are not going to have spontaneous recovery. Why this is very important is in practical scenarios and from a medical legal standpoint, you take the donor cells and you harvest the donor cells and keep them, because once you have given a myeloablative conditioning and the donor, especially for matched unrelated donor, someone else unrelated to the patient is giving, and the donor runs away, you're in a soup, because these patients are going to die of cytopenias and infection. Now, coming to the non-myeloablative regimens, they cause minimal cytopenia. However, the engrafting, the donor T cells would eventually eliminate the host hematopoietic stem cells, and they take over the hematopoiesis. Non-myeloablative and when we say reduced intensity, it is somewhere between these two extremes, myeloablative and non-myeloablative. So these cause cytopenia, definitely. They require hematopoietic stem cell transplant, definitely. But the cytopenias may not be as severe as a myeloablative one, and the toxicities are less than myeloablative ones. So this reduced intensity conditioning and non-myeloablative conditioning regimens, you try to use them in situations where there are comorbid conditions and the underlying disease is well under control, to decrease the chance of toxicities and have an equal efficacy. You do use this conditioning regimen. That's where they roll. So the choice of regimen among the three, how do you select which one to go, depends upon the recipient comorbidities. So if the patient has a lot of comorbidities, borderline renal function, borderline lung function, a bit elderly age, 60 to 63 years of age, and his performance status is just 2 kind of thing, and you know the disease is life threatening and transplant is the only way. Those patients, again, an RIC is preferred over a myeloablative. But a big cut, but is because of the underlying condition. So the disease in question should be under control. An acute myeloid leukemia, if you are going for an allogeneic stem cell transplant and the disease is active, you wouldn't go for an RIC conditioning. Yes, people have done that, but as a thumb rule, you just don't go for it, because you want, in an active disease, you want the dual effect. You want the chemotherapy, the conditioning regimen to act on the leukemia, as well as you want to have that graft versus leukemia effect as well. If the disease is under complete remission, then an RIC regimen along is sufficient, produces equal outcomes as a myeloablative regimen. So, and again, myeloablative regimens are most commonly the way for autologous stem cell transplant. So the risk of rejection, so graft rejection based on the again, the risk of graft rejection, if you don't use the required conditioning, especially when you use RIC regimen, there is still a chance of risk of graft rejection, especially when there is HLA disparity, or like I said, there is donor specific HLA antibodies, or if the stem cell dose is less, or there are T cell depleted grafts. So these are the issues which you actually take into consideration when you are using the choice of regimen, whether there is increased risk of graft rejection, the disease status, and the recipient comorbidities. For autologous stem cell transplant, the principle is simple. It's because the high doses of chemotherapy act on the residual disease, and you are just giving the stem cells to rescue the marrow. So myeloablative regimens are commonly used in all autologous stem cell transplants. The concept of RIC and non-myeloablative regimens only comes in patients who are not eligible for MAC regimens in allogenic stem cell transplant. You don't use a RIC transplant in autologous setting. So the most common conditioning regimen, myeloablative regimens which we use is cyclophosphamide TBI, total body irradiation, is commonly used in acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Busulfan and cyclophosphamide, high doses. Fludarabine and busulfan which is given for 4 days. These three are acute leukemia regimens. The Cy-TBI is most commonly in ALL patients. Bucy and Flubu are most commonly used in acute myeloid leukemias. Beam and CBV are the common myeloablative regimens which we use in lymphomas, and single agent melphalan which we commonly use in the plasma cell dyscrasias. Depending upon their renal function, the dose is somewhere between 140 to 200 mg per meter square. For an RIC, you use fludarabine, total body irradiation, or total lymphocyte irradiation with ATG, Flumel, Flubu. Here, the busulfan is only given for 2 days, which comes again RIC. If it's given for 4 days, it becomes a myeloablative regimen. Flucy and fludarabine, busulfan, and thiotepa. So most of these regimens are again used in conditions where in patients who have comorbidities, and also in conditions where there is already a marrow problem like aplastic anemias. You don't require a myeloablative regimen because there is already hardly any cellularity in the marrow already in an aplastic anemia, or in a primary immunodeficiency, or in bone marrow failure syndromes, especially the bone marrow failure syndromes where already the bone marrow cellularity is affected. You don't require a myeloablative conditioning regimens, high doses of drugs to ablate the marrow. An RIC is as good as your MAC in these conditions. Now, after the conditioning regimen and the infusion of the stem cells, so most of these stem cells for an autologous stem cell or an allogenic stem cell transplant, the minimum required dose you take is 2.5 cells per kg into 10 to the power 6. 2.5 into 10 to the power of 6 cells per kg. This is the minimum dose which is required so that an adequate engraftment happens. So doses less than this have also been tried, but there are increased chances of graft failure in allogenic and also prolonged recovery in case of autologous stem cell transplant. So you make sure that you at least have 2.5 into 10 power 6 cells per kg of cells before taking the patient for the transplant or starting your conditioning regimens. And these stem cells stay at refrigerator at minus 8 to minus 20 degrees centigrade for a period of 4 days. Now, if you are giving some of these conditioning regimens are there for like 7 days or 8 days. So in that case, where the stem cell viability is going to get affected, you are going to cryopreserve them. Or suppose in myeloma patients, where the patient is not ready for transplant upfront, and the patient wants a transplant at the time of relapse. In those patients, when you expect the patient is going to be on anti-myeloma therapy for a longer duration, which would affect the stem cell quantity, the stem cell harvest. In those patients, you harvest the stem cells immediately after the patient goes into remission, and you cryopreserve them and store. The cryopreservation, and you store them at minus 80 for a longer duration of time. You can keep it for years together. So after the conditioning regimen, on day 0, you give the stem cells. It is basically as simple as a blood transfusion. The only thing is you're giving it as a stem cell. Now in allogenic stem cell transplant, in autologous, there is nothing much. Your job is done. You have done conditioning. You have given adequate cell dose. Now you just need to manage the duration of neutropenia. Whereas in allogenic stem cell transplant, now you fear the graft versus host disease. So you need to give certain prophylaxis with immunosuppression so that they don't develop graft versus host disease. So what are the principles of a graft versus host disease prophylaxis. So most common choice is a dual drug, whether it is a methotrexate with cyclosporin or methotrexate with tacrolimus. Both of them, cyclosporin or tacrolimus, are calcineurin inhibitors. And the methotrexate regimen is a short course regimen which you give on day 1, 3, 6, 11 of transplant, which is the day 0 is your stem cell infusion. So from that day, day 1, 3, 6 and 11, you give a short course of intravenous methotrexate. And then you give your CNI, which is either cyclosporin or tacrolimus, and you give it for 6 months. Then you slowly taper if there is no GVHD. So there is no head-to-head comparison between cyclosporin and tacrolimus, but most of the retrospective data shows that both are equally efficacious. So the choice is based on one's ease of using either of the drugs. You also monitor the tacrolimus or cyclosporin levels at a periodic intervals and try to maintain the dose at certain level so that there is adequate immunosuppression, and which is enough for your GVHD, for prevention of GVHD. The other most common agent is mycophenolate mofetil plus a calcineurin inhibitor, which is cyclosporin or tacrolimus. So this MMF and calcineurin inhibitor, preferably you most commonly use in haplo or in a cord blood transplant, because especially in cord blood transplant you try to avoid methotrexate because the risk of graft failure is high with methotrexate in a cord blood transplant. So apart from that, a very important, I think this slide is quite busy. Just check this. So apart from this, especially when you are using this haploidentical transplant, where or a mismatched transplant, where you know that the risk of GVHD is going to be high because of mismatch, you do a T cell depletion. So this T cell depletion has actually changed the way the transplants have done, because at any given point of time, either to registered donor registries or for a matched sibling transplant, the chance of finding a donor, suitable matched donor for any patient is very less. Whereas a haploidentical donors are readily available in the family. So the source of donor is cheap if someone doesn't have a matched sibling, and they are readily available, so that there a lot of time is not wasted and risking the disease relapse in these patients. So it's all because of the T cell depletion. So the T cell depletion is associated with significant lower incidence of grade 3, grade 4 acute GVHD. The two most common things which we use is ATG and post-transplant cyclophosphamide. So ATG has a more effect on the decreased incidence of chronic GVHD, whereas cyclophosphamide, post-transplant cyclophosphamide, decreases the incidence of acute and chronic GVHD in allogenic stem cell transplants. The effect is so good that previously we were using it for haploidentical transplant. Now we have been using even for matched sibling as well as matched unrelated donor transplant also, post-transplant high-dose cyclophosphamide at 50 mg per kg on days 3 and 4 as a single agent. Along with that, when we use this post-transplant site, we used MMF and TAC or any CNI inhibitors. The chances of graft rejection and as well as the decreased incidence of acute and chronic GVHD is more. So this has become pretty standard, what we call as the John Hopkins regimen, and this has changed the way we started doing transplant, and there has been sudden increase in the number of haploidentical transplants which are being done worldwide. So now coming to the most important aspect of a transplant, after going through the logistics of finding a donor, so selecting the right conditioning regimen, the most important thing is management of the complications. So most of the time, you know what are the complications which are going to occur at what time point, and it's the preparation of the family and the expectant management of the treating transplant physician would help in improving the outcomes. So if you have to divide the risk of complications, it depends again on a lot of factors like the type of transplant, whether it is allogenic or autologous. Autologous, most of the complications are early, long term, less. Pre-transplant factors, whether how much pre-hematopoietic stem cell transplant immunosuppressive therapy the patient received, the time of transplant, lower risk with more time elapsed from the transplant, GVHD, higher risk of grade 3 with grade 3, grade 4 GVHD, HLA mismatched donors, disease status, the donor type. So all the things which we discussed earlier, the conditioning regimen which we use, whether it's a myeloablative or a RIC, the toxicities differ based either early complications or late complications. So to broadly divide them, early complications are the ones which you see in the initial couple of months of transplant, and or during the transplant, till the time of engraftment, and the late complications, especially the infectious complications and GVHD in case of allogenic stem cell transplant. So coming to the early complications, the hematological ones would be in both allogenic and autologous would be because of the myelosuppression, cytopenias, bleeding, thrombotic microangiopathy, especially with myeloablative transplants and in allogenic stem cell transplant, patients presenting with thrombotic microangiopathy occurs in around 2 to 5% of patients. Oral mucositis, more common with myeloablative regimens and when we use TBI, and you manage them with good pain management and nutritional support. Palifermin, photobiomodulation, cryotherapy are the other options which we don't often use because of the inavailability. Most often you go with the pain management and the nutritional support. Then comes diarrhea, where the causes of diarrhea could be many. It could be acute GVHD, it could be infectious, most commonly viral and Clostridium, non-oral mucositis because of TBI, and someone who has, especially what we see in myeloma, someone who had this spine radiation, especially in the lumbar spine, they do have a lot of GI mucositis, which leads to a lot of diarrhea. Drugs, cord colitis syndrome and cord blood, especially what we see in cord blood transplants, patients develop this cord colitis syndrome, which is basically a bacterial infection. Liver dysfunction, which could be because in the early part it could be because of hepatic sinusoidal obstruction syndrome, and in the later part it could be because of GVHD. Just a minute. So now coming to the hepatic sinusoidal obstruction syndrome. So the risk factors, this is the an early liver complications which we see especially with myeloablative regimens, and it is seen in the first 15 to 20 days of transplant. So the most common is risk factors include pre-existing liver disease, especially viral hepatitis, the choice of conditioning regimen, especially when we use busulfan based regimens, source of graft, and patient's age. It is higher in children less than 7 years. The clinical manifestations would be in the post-transplant period when the patient has weight gain, tender hepatomegaly, and conjugated hyperbilirubinemia. The prevention, we use low molecular weight heparin, and more than that, we commonly use ursodeoxycholic acid, which is Udiliv, which we commonly use. This is known to decrease the risk of hepatic sinusoidal syndrome. And for treatment part, even defibrotide is available, which is used, which had shown some efficacy in patients who have already had onset of hepatic sinusoidal syndrome, and you can use it as a prevention strategy, especially when when the risk of hepatic sinusoidal obstruction syndrome is high, especially when you're using busulfan based regimen for a child less than 7 years, and in an allogenic stem cell transplant. You have three of the risk factors where you can use it as a prevention strategy as well. Now, the other important one is pulmonary complications. There could be range of complications ranging from diffuse alveolar hemorrhage in the early transplant period to idiopathic pulmonary syndrome, bronchoobliterans pneumonia, GVHD, engraftment syndrome. This particular syndrome, engraftment syndrome, particularly seen in plasma cell dyscrasia, where the patient presents in the peri-engraftment time. There is increase in the WBC count, weight gain, dyspnea, and fever. Most commonly, differential would be sepsis, but these patients, it's very important to differentiate between the both because they respond well to steroids, and it's mostly transient in most of the cases. The other rare complications are idiopathic pulmonary syndrome, pulmonary cytolytic thrombi, and pulmonary alveolar proteinosis. Idiopathic pulmonary syndrome recommends a special mention because it is seen in patients who are prior exposed to rituximab. So when they undergo autologous stem cell transplant, especially in B-cell lymphomas, there is this risk of idiopathic pulmonary syndrome, which typically presents like an interstitial lung disease on your CT scan. Now, infections, the most dreaded complications of any transplant, and the time period in which they occur. So if you come to an autologous stem cell transplant and the timing at which the infections which are most common are in the pre-engraftment period after the conditioning regimen. The most common viral would be your herpes simplex. All bacterial infections can occur before the engraftment, gram-positive, gram-negative. What we most commonly see is the gram-negative sepsis, and fungal, it is disseminated candidiasis. Sometimes also aspergillosis, especially when the patient had prolonged steroids and multiple lines of chemotherapy. The risk factors, mucositis, where there is where the natural barriers are broken when you give high doses of chemotherapy, neutropenia, and organ dysfunctions. They all predispose to bacterial infections. Among fungal, candida is more common. Now, post-engraftment, the bacterial infections, even though they are common, but they are lesser as compared to the viral and the pneumocystis infection. Because most of the viral infections and pneumocystis are cell-mediated immunity occur when there is decreased cell-mediated immunity. So this decreased cell-mediated immunity is because after the transplant, the immune reconstitution takes around 12 to 18 months time. So because of this, the cell-mediated immunity is less, and they are susceptible to variety of these viral and pneumocystis infection. So in some centers, we do continue an antiviral prophylaxis for herpes and pneumocystis prophylaxis with cotrimoxazole for 6 months to 1 year. It depends on center to center. The bacterial infections only when patient gets sick post engraftment and they get a really bad bug from a multi-drug resistant organism. So in allogenic stem cell transplant, there are again the pre-engraftment and the post-engraftment ones. So the pre and the post-engraftment are more or less similar to the autologous stem cell transplant, but what is different is the late phase, where you actually use a lot of anti GVHD prophylaxis, immunosuppression, which predisposes them to a lot of other infections, mostly the viral infections, encapsulated bacterial infections, pneumocystis and aspergillus infections, and particularly certain rare viruses like DK virus, which causes hemorrhagic cystitis, are also common in late phase rather than in the post-engraftment or in the pre-engraftment phase. So they continue to have decreased immunity for a longer duration as compared to autologous stem cell transplant patients. So a very important thing is to monitor for these complications. The other dreaded and most which decides the course, the survival, is the development of GVHD, which can be acute or hyperacute. Acute and hyperacute is one which develops within a few days of the stem cell infusion, and this occurs only in allogenic stem cell transplant. So the risk factors include the degree of HLA disparity. The more the mismatch, the higher the risk. The donor and recipient gender disparity, like I said, if the female donor to male recipient has higher risk of acute GVHD, intensity of transplant conditioning regimen, and acute GVHD prophylactic regimen used. So most often when you use a single agent drug for immunosuppression, you are likely to have more acute GVHD. And the source. Previously, bone marrow cells, the stem cells were collected from the bone marrow. Now that procedure is obsolete. We use peripheral blood stem cells. We give the patients growth factors and harvest from the peripheral blood stem cells. And the harvesting from the peripheral blood stem cells, the risk of GVHD is less. Umbilical cord blood transplants have the lowest risk of acute GVHD because they are quite naive, unexposed. So the chance of developing GVHD is less in these patients, despite a mismatch. So when we talk of acute GVHD, which can occur in the first 100 days, it is the presence of most common affected organ is GI tract and skin. So most patients present with skin lesions, erythematous papules, bullae, and maculopapular rash, GI tract with diarrhea. So these are the most common. Liver only GVHD is rare, but it can be part. Liver only GVHD occurs only in 4%, but most of the time when liver is involved, GI tract and skin are involved in most of the patients, which constitute 24%. So the most common would be GI tract and skin in acute GVHD. So what do we see in skin? Which the rash could be erythematous, maculopapular, bullous, desquamating, mostly involving palms and soles, and they are often pruritic. Liver, there is hepatomegaly, right upper quadrant tendon. So this is the thumb rule. Any patient who develops these symptoms, hepatomegaly, right upper quadrant tenderness, and hyperbilirubinemia, in the first 10 to 14 days of transplant, you attribute it to hepatic sinusoidal syndrome, and after that you attribute it to acute GVHD, and the management differs. And in gut, GI tract, it's most commonly diarrhea, which could be a bloody diarrhea, and there can also be a lot of abdominal pain. So the prevention is use a good dual agent anti immunosuppressive drugs, but despite that, you are likely to still have acute GVHD. And the treatment when they occur is first line is glucocorticoid. Most oftenly we use methylprednisolone, and the second line of drugs are MMF, etanercept, sirolimus, ruxolitinib. Ruxolitinib has come as a big way, especially in refractory GVHD, and so is ibrutinib. So among the early, apart from the acute GVHD, the early complications also include neurological and renal complications. The most common neurological is thrombotic microangiopathy, and the psychiatric complications like delirium and depression. So that's what is very important when you are keeping a patient in an isolation HEPA filtered room for 3 to 4 weeks. A good psychosocial assessment before taking transplant is very important. Often, especially when these patients develop complications and they need to take a lot of medications, polypharmacy, and underlying disease, most of these patients tend to develop depression, and a good psychosocial support and early involvement of a psychiatrist is very important. Renal complications, often because of drugs or because of the transplant related the thrombotic microangiopathy, there can be renal dysfunction which can occur early in the disease. Now coming to the late complications, Among the most common late complication is chronic GVHD. Now, these are the same risk factors which we have told you for acute GVHD, also holds true for chronic GVHD. Apart from that, previous splenectomy, CMV seropositivity and donor Epstein-Barr virus seropositivity are associated more with GVHD. So, patient who develops an acute GVHD also has a risk of developing chronic GVHD. So, for chronic GVHD, the skin manifestations are slightly different. You find a sclerodermitis or lichenoid changes more often than a rash. And in liver, it is similar to acute GVHD. There is conjugated hyperbilirubinemia, raised raised liver enzymes, coagulation abnormalities, and in gut, most often it is abdominal pain, nausea, weight loss. Pulmonary, which you don't often see in acute GVHD, you see it in chronic GVHD. They can develop interstitial lung disease, which could be BOOP, or something like an idiopathic pulmonary syndrome kind of thing, where they develop chronic hypoxia and shortness of breath. And pulmonary and liver GHD are most of the, when they do occur at a higher degree, they are associated with high mortality. And also the mucosa is also involved with eyes and mouth, dryness of eyes and mouth in chronic GVHD. So the most common is again the mucosa, skin and mucosa. Liver and lung come the second most common. GI tract somehow is less. The joints and fascia also sometimes get involved, but this is the cumulative from grade 1 to grade 4. So the grade 3 or 4 chronic GVHD tends to occur in 15 to 20% of cases, irrespective of your transplant. So if you are going for a haplotransplant or a mismatched transplant, the risk of chronic GVHD might be higher, say to the tune of 30%. And the grade 1, grade 3, grade 4 would be somewhere between 15 to 20%. At least this is the minimum. We need to tell the patients that you are going to have this one. But again, when the indication, your primary indication is something as bad as acute myeloid leukemia, the choices are less. But nonetheless, these are the things we need to counsel the patient. So again, most common is increasing your CNI dose, prolonging the CNI dose beyond the 6 months period, steroids, rituximab, ruxolitinib, ibrutinib have been used in refractory chronic GVHD. Of these, most important, ibrutinib and ruxolitinib of late has shown good trial data in relapsed refractory chronic GVHD. Now, the other effects, like I told, infection because of delayed immune reconstitution, it could be as less as 12 months in an autologous to even longer for allogenic stem cell transplant. Like whatever in allogenic stem cell transplant, because if someone has GVHD and uses prolonged immunosuppressive drugs and there is T cell depletion, they are likely to have more infections, especially the viral and the fungal. And the other problems which we see, especially in the transplant survivors, children who underwent transplant for various solid tumors or hematological malignancies, in their adulthood, most of them develop some form of cardiovascular disease because of dyslipidemia, hypertension, diabetes, LV dysfunction. There are also certain cognitive disturbances, neurological seizures and stroke. They are at a higher risk of all your metabolic syndrome. To just put it in a single word, patients who have undergone hematological stem cell transplant in the long run are more likely to have these metabolic diseases of hypertension, diabetes, strokes, heart attacks. And there are a lot of endocrine abnormalities which do occur in children who undergo transplant. Growth disturbances, hypothyroidism, hypogonadism, precocious infertility, obesity, which is sarcopenic. The muscle mass is less and the patient is obese. Osteopenia, avascular necrosis, metabolic syndrome, which includes insulin resistance. and above all, they are at an increased risk of second malignancies. So, so patients who undergo hematopoietic stem cell transplant, especially for solid tumor, develop new solid tumors twice as expected to the general population. And the cumulative incidence of solid tumors increases as the years pass by, reaching up to 3 to 4% after 20 years of transplant. They are at increased risk of malignant melanoma, cancers of buccal cavity, liver, brain, thyroid, bone, and connective tissue cancers. So, among the patients who underwent transplant below the age of 30, the highest risk of secondary malignancies is seen in patients who underwent transplant for AML, followed by ALL, and then CML. However, the number of patients undergoing CML patients undergoing transplant have reduced drastically. So, I would say that patients who are acute myeloid leukemias who are less than age of 30 and who undergo transplant are at a higher chance of developing second malignancy if they live longer. So, the increased risk of secondary malignancies post transplant is more for aplastic anemia patients and patients who have undergone transplant for hematological malignancies than non-hematological conditions like thalassemias, primary immunodeficiency disorders, enzyme disorders. In these patients, the risk of secondary malignancies is less as compared to those with aplastic and hematological malignancies, because these patients undergo a lot of chemotherapy or treatment prior to transplant, whereas non-hematological conditions, most of them, you just need to ablate the marrow for once. With this, I complete the presentation, and now we can take any questions.
Sir, what are the second malignancies we see?
So, most common second malignancies which we see, like I enumerated, buccal mucosa, brain tumors, melanomas, and secondary leukemias also occur, especially when we use these certain drugs in your conditioning regimen, thiotepa, etoposide, when we use it for germ cell tumors, for relapsed refractory germ cell tumors, where you use a lot of etoposides, you also see secondary acute leukemias as well. But most common solid tumors would be melanomas, buccal cavity, lung cancer, brain tumors are the common ones.
Sir, what is the rationale of transplant in germ cell tumor and Ewing sarcoma?
Yeah, so it's not like every patient of germ cell tumor or Ewing sarcoma need to undergo transplant. So in certain patients, in germ cell tumor patients who are relapsed refractory, where there is some form of residual disease, yet there is a chemosensitive disease. So here the rationale is you try to give a higher dose of chemotherapy that would eventually kill the residual disease in this chemosensitive disease. But when you give those high supernormal doses of chemotherapy, you need a stem cell rescue. So the role is definitely you don't have a head-to-head trial or a positive trial saying that it is the mode of treatment for a relapsed germ cell, but in a relapsed refractory in select population. The same thing in Ewing sarcoma, someone who has relapsed with a low volume disease and with a good salvage regimen went into complete remission. The consolidation with a advised. So it's quite selective. You don't use it in every patient.
Thank you, sir.
Any more questions, or we are done for the day?
Sir, can you? Okay.
Okay, then if we are done for the day, I think we can leave the meeting.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much.
Yeah.